When solving an inequality, we must make sure, like we did with equations, that all our information is on one side and we have 0 on the other side. When we do this, we're going to take the x over 4 to the left-hand side. In other words, I'm now going to have 4 all over x minus x all over 4, and that's still going to be less than or equal to 0. Remember, I told you that when you have an inequality and it's not a polynomial, in other words, it has a denominator, you are not allowed to get rid of the denominator. So in my next step, I need to use the LCD to find a lowest common denominator for the terms on the left. The lowest common denominator that I'm going to be using must be the most of each type of factor. And so I'm going to use the factor 4 and the factor x. Now if I write this over a common denominator, my common denominator, remember, must be the LCD. So my common denominator is going to be 4x. The first term had an x, so it needs the 4, and 4 times 4 is 16. The second term had an had a 4, but it needs an x, and so its numerator is going to be x squared. If you take a look at the numerator, you can see that the x term is not in a reducing degree from left to right. So I'm going to switch those terms around in the numerator by taking out a highest common factor of minus 1. In other words, doing that, I'm going to get minus and then x squared minus 16. This is still all over the common denominator of 4x. And now if I, in my next step, divide both sides by minus 1, I must change my inequality sign around. In other words, my inequality is now going to look as follows. You need to know that if you want to find an inequality, you need to know what your critical values would be. As my numerator is not fully factorized, that is what I need to do in my next step. X squared minus 16 can be factorized nicely using a difference of 2 squares. In other words, that could be written as x plus 4 and x minus 4. And that's still all over the denominator of 4x. As I have only factorized, I don't change anything else in my expression. Now I need to know what my critical values would be if I'm going to put them onto my number line. Now remember, I told you that if you're going to find your critical values, and it's an inequality, not an equation, you're not allowed to use the LCD to get rid of the denominator, because that is a very important value. My LCD may never be equal to 0. In other words, the critical values that I'm going to find here are going to be when x is equal to minus 4 and 4, and when x is equal to 0. As in the expression that I used to find my critical values, all my factors were written with the x term first, and there was no constant common factor of a minus number. I'm allowed to find the intervals that are going to be the plus intervals, the greater than intervals, and I'm allowed to use the zeros. Putting the critical values onto my number line, the smallest number was minus 4, and then 0, and then 4. As all my information was perfectly in order, I start with the interval on the very far right-hand side, and that interval will always be a plus. As none of my critical values were repeated, I do not repeat signs. So I go plus, minus, plus, minus. Remember that the 0 critical value came from your denominator, so that critical value may never be used because it would give you an undefined expression. But the inequality that I'm looking for has to be the plus intervals, but also the zeros for the other critical values. In other words, I'm allowed to use the critical value of minus 4 or 4. I'm now ready to find my intervals. As I'm looking for my plus intervals, I'm going to go from minus 4 to 0, and I'm going to go from 4 all the way to positive infinity. And now if I write that up in interval notation, I just read off my number line from left to right. These intervals that I'm representing are going to be that if I drew this graph where it had positive y values or zeros, in other words, they would have been when x was -4 all the way up to when x was 0, excluding when x was 0, or when x was 4 all the way up to infinity.